Okay.
All right. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. Today is April 13th, 2021. I'm Steve Shields, President of the Royal Asiatic Society, Korea. On behalf of the officers and council, I welcome you. The Royal Asiatic Society traces its beginnings to India in the late 1700s and was formally chartered in London in 1824 by King George IV. The Royal Asiatic Society of Great Britain and Ireland granted a charter to the Korea branch in 1900, the fourth year of the Gyeongbokgung Emperor of Korea. RAS Korea expresses sincere thanks to our generous sponsor, Asia Development Foundation, for their third year of support. We also thank our members who have paid their annual fees. Your dues provide essential primary funding for us, without which we would not be able to host this lecture series. If you are not yet a member, we humbly request a one-time admission fee. There's a donation page theoretically on your screen, if I can get to it. And I've also put information in the chat box for you to refer to. Frankly, we'd rather have you join us as a member. It only takes a few minutes to sign up. Membership gives you the opportunity to support an organization whose main purpose for over 120 years has been to explore and promote all facets of Korea's rich heritage. You have the opportunity to meet leading scholars in the field of Korean studies. Members receive discounts on RAS books, and you also would receive our annual journal, Transactions. A link is posted in the chat box to our website for all of that information. We're joined tonight by Dr. Robert Fouser in the US I thought it was dark early, but it looks like the sun's coming up in your window there.
Yeah.
We appreciate Robert's willingness to be up so early to share with us. I haven't had as good luck with some other potential lecturers for us who said no, they didn't think they could do it. So we're grateful, Robert. Thank you. Robert holds a BA in Japanese language and literature, an MA in applied linguistics, and a PhD in applied linguistics from Trinity College, Dublin. He studied Korean language at Seoul National University in the 80s, lived in Japan in the late 90s, early 2000s, where he taught foreign language. And he developed a Korean language program at Kagoshima University there. From 2008 to 2014, he taught Korean as a second foreign language at Seoul National University. He's currently an independent scholar based in Providence, Rhode Island. There's a whole list of books that Robert has either written in English or in Korean or in, I suppose, Japanese or translated. Fantastic, interesting stuff. A new book called I can't read romanization, Robert. Waegugo Haksupdam?
Waegugo Haksupdam, yes.
Yep. Thoughts on learning foreign languages will be published next month, apparently, in May.
Hopefully.
And we often see Robert's columns in various media outlets here in Korea. So after the lecture, as usual, we'll have time for questions and answers. So please welcome Dr. Fouser. Robert, take it away.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be here. I always love talking to the RAS. It's one of the highlights of my visits to Korea annually, which unfortunately I haven't been able to do, but hopefully that will happen sooner rather than later. I'd like to start. I'm going to share a screen. Says you can't share the screen while the other, maybe I can try again. There we go. Okay. And so today, what I'm going to talk about is I became interested in this topic after moving back to the United States in 2014, and I experienced my first cold winter. I now live in Rhode Island, but I was living in Michigan at the time. And I experienced my first Michigan winter in about 30 years, and my feet were cold all the time. So I became interested in Ondol and various experiments that had taken place. relating to Ondol in the US. And of course, as the winter went along, I started to think, well, maybe I wonder, what it's like if we could have Ondol in the United States, or are there any experiments with Ondol in the United States? And I found in that process, I found that Frank Lloyd Wright had done a lot of experiments with Ondol in the middle of the early part of the 20th century. And that led my interest into researching what Wright had done and how he became interested in Ondol in the first place. So that is the main topic of my presentation, is Wright's discovery of Ondol in his visit to Japan, and then later how he tried to implement it. And I will also talk about a sort of mini Ondol boom right after the Second World War that lasted until the early mid 1950s and then faded away. And only recently has there been interest in heated floors in the United States. And I'll talk about that at the end of the presentation. Can everybody hear me? Is everything okay? Yeah, good, okay. So I will first talk about Frank Lloyd Wright, and then I will talk about other experiments that may have been influenced. We have two big names there, other experiments with underfloor heating, Mies van der Rohe and Phillip Johnson. These are big names. I couldn't find out whether they were influenced by Wright or not, because as you know, or people, if you know famous architects, probably among human beings, famous architects have some of the biggest egos in the world, and they often don't like to point to who influenced them. Others, and the Levittown, those are direct influences from Wright, and I have documentation for that. So clearly what Wright did created the atmosphere for these other two famous architects to follow, and then other people to pick up on what he was doing. And in the conclusion, I will talk about why in the mid 1950s, the underfloor heating started to decline, and then talk about Wright's legacy and what's going on recently. So all of you know, when we think of Ondol, recently when I talk to young people, the things that you think everybody knows about, they don't know about. And what I'm talking about Ondol, I'm not talking about the heated pipes that run under the floors in, say, your Korean house that you live in now. What I'm talking about is the traditional system where you have a fire at one end that was also used for cooking, and then the heat of the fire would run under the floors and heat the floors in the process as it moved through to a chimney on the other side of the room. So this is the Ondol type of system that was common in Korea until, say, the 1950s, 1960s, when water pipes started to come in. And of course, really, it wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s that water pipes became sort of the standard for the heating system in Korea. So this is the type of Ondol system that Wright would have discovered when he went to Japan, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So again, I will first talk about Wright, various experiments, and then Levittown. And Frank Lloyd Wright is, a lot of people will say he's the most famous American architect. Probably I would agree with that. But like the other architects, Mies van der Rohe and Philip Johnson, Wright had a humongous ego, and he dominated the architectural discussion, the architecture scene in the United States, from really the turn of the 20th century all the way until his death in 1959. And his last major project was the Guggenheim Museum in New York, which I'm looking forward to going to once things reopen, but it's a fabulous place. So he really dominated and was the sort of prestige architect in the United States. And that's very important, that Wright's prestige and his dominance really led to him being in a position to sort of promote or raise awareness of underfloor radiant heating. So that is something that's very important. The other thing about Wright is some people say he was a narcissist. I don't know, but he had a tremendous ego, that we know. And he also was not trained as an architect. He was not a certified architect. And so he had this very sort of stance toward the architectural profession. So he was the leading architect, but he was also critical of everybody else and critical of the profession as a whole. And that influenced some things related to radiant heat, some developments related to underfloor radiant heat. So right in historical context, he, as you can see, he was born 2 years after the Civil War. He lived a very long life. And he would have been, say, in his 20s in the 1880s. And then this is when you started to have technological improvement. And he was started practicing or getting into architecture in the Chicago area. And that is important because Chicago was a booming city at the time. So I'll talk about those first two things and then the rise of modernism and the repudiation of historical styles. If you think about Victorian houses or housing in the late 19th century, several things happened. That first was plumbing, and this allowed these fixtures that the toilet would have been outside a lot of times or not in the house. The development of plumbing allowed for fixtures to come in. And so that gave architects another room to really deal with. And the technology of getting water and sewage out, getting water in and sewage out, this really developed in the late 19th century. And of course, Thomas Crapper, a British guy, was the person who improved the technology of the toilet. That's where the word crap comes from. And he also developed the drain, which allowed for odors, which prevented odors from coming into the room. So that was a big technological improvement. Heating, the radiator, the steam systems, this developed. Before this, it was fireplaces. And if you were lucky, you had more than one fireplace. A lot of smaller houses only had one. So wood burning as the main heat was the main heat source up until the late 19th century. And then electricity started to come in. I think Thomas Edison invented or, was able to control electricity in 1882, and it very slowly made its way into houses. So all of these things allowed for architects to do more. They allowed houses to be better. They allowed houses to be more livable and that kind of thing. And so Wright was growing up at this time or becoming an architect with these new technological features. The Chicago boom, Chicago in the late 19th century was the booming American city. And I was shocked to find that, say, in 1900, Chicago was the fourth largest city in the world. It had grown to be even larger than Tokyo, which had a long history of being a large city. Some of the other cities, Beijing, for example, had a very long history of being a city over 1 million people. And Chicago just boomed to pass these cities. So it was by 1900, it had grown into the fourth largest city in the world. And a growing city means contracts, jobs, experimentation. And of course, people who were living in Chicago at the time, there was a lot of wealth created, and wealthy clients then started to look to build bigger houses, and they had more money to experiment. Architects like wealthy clients because wealthy clients give architects more room to experiment, more room to try out what they want to do rather than smaller houses and public works projects. The other thing, of course, was at this time we have the rise of modernism, and modernism really rose as it was a slower rise than we often think. But Wright studied or apprenticed with Louis Sullivan. Louis Sullivan was a major architect who started developing skyscrapers and buildings using iron foundation structures. So he was a very innovative architect at the time, and he came up with the term, which is very famous, form follows function. And this led to the idea that you get rid of decoration, decoration is superfluous, decoration isn't necessary, buildings should be functional. And from there, Wright added to that the idea that no house should ever be on a hill or on anything. It should be of the hill, belonging to it. Hill and house should live together, each the happier for the other. So Wright wanted to integrate buildings into their natural setting. He didn't want buildings to dominate as sort of decorative structures. And this desire to create something new, to break with the past of Victorian architecture. If you've ever seen Victorian architect, big Victorian houses in, say, a small US city or town, they're often the biggest house on the street. They dominate, they don't fit, they don't, they want to show wealth and things. Wright was, again, capturing the spirit of his times. He wanted to go against this. And you can see this in Wright's home and studio. The first part of it was built in 1889. And this looks kind of Victorian, but you can see that he's already kind of getting rid of a lot of decoration and focusing on the form. He wanted the interior space to be big. And so he made this big interior space, and that created this large sort of roof line, which at the time would have been odd. This would have been not what would have been done in the late Victorian time, but Wright was pushing it. He wanted to focus on the form follows function idea. And again, the hidden sort of, you have to search for the entrance. The entrance should be sort of not obvious. This is a feature of Wright's work that started at this time as well. The Roby house in Chicago, this is only about 20 years later. And you can see that Wright was just exploding the spaces. He was really trying to break away from the conventional box, the conventional shape of houses, and trying to create something that was a departure from history. And this is a very important part of modernism. They didn't want to take historical styles and reproduce them or revive them. The idea was to make something new that had not been done before. And I actually took this picture when I visited the Roby house. I visited the other house, but it was interesting when they explained in the tour that the living room of Wright's, this Roby house, was full of glass. It's a beautiful space. But the owner complained that it was too cold. And Wright just said, well, if it's too cold, wear more clothes or, deal with it. And the owner eventually didn't live here very long just because this, the living room with all the glass was so cold. So Wright often had conflicts with some of his clients, or he often had he was interested in aesthetic rather than practicality. And that appeared in this house. It appeared in other houses he designed, leaky roofs, for example. Wright was famous for leaky roofs. So his approach to architecture, rather than making something that was necessary, that would be easy to reproduce or popular or something that for the masses, he was interested in pursuing his aesthetic and philosophy first. And Wright's first encounter with a Japanese building would have been the Ohoden at the Columbian Exhibition in Chicago. Again, the influence of Chicago in 1893. And this was a major international exposition held in and then Japan made a big splash. And remember, Japan at this time had been the Meiji Restoration in 1868 put Japan on the process of, unquote, modernization, and Japan was imitating Western ideas and trying to build a strong nation state. And part of the narrative of that was then Japan wanted to show people overseas that Japan was a major player on the world stage, and having a big exhibit in a world exposition was one thing that Japan did to show its status as a rising nation. And this is a remake or a takeoff on the Byodo-in in Kyoto. And this was the first Japanese building that Wright would have seen. He hadn't been to Japan at this time. So this influenced him a great deal. It was a big hit. And it was a big hit had a lot of press and a lot of people saw it. So Wright would have been one of the people who saw this and was surprised by the organization of the spaces and how different it was from the architecture that he knew at the time. And that stimulated his interest in Japan. And Wright made 3 visits, or at least 3 periods. He visited Japan 3 periods. He first went to Japan in 1905. He did extensive travel, and he left a photographic record, which is very interesting because he traveled all the way from Tokyo, all the way to Okayama and other parts in Western Honshu, which would not have been the areas, those were not necessarily popular tourist places for foreigners at the time. And that indicates that he was talking to certain Japanese people who were telling him to go to certain places, for example, the Korakuen in Okayama, to visit different type temples, different places. And so he made and left, and that was his first, this was his first visit, and he did a lot of traveling, saw a lot of buildings, so he was able to pick up on his interest in Japanese architecture. In 1913, he made a business trip to secure the Imperial Hotel Commission. And then after he got that commission, from 1917 to 1922, he spent 3 years off and on and supervising the construction of the Imperial Hotel. And this is the Imperial Hotel. It has since been torn down, and the entrance part is now preserved in Meiji-mura, which is near Nagoya, and that is a sort of collection of historic buildings that have been preserved. But this is a postcard of the original hotel. It was a massive project, and of course, it's also famous for it opened on the day of the earthquake in 1923, and it survived the earthquake. And Wright was in the middle of Wright had left Japan and arrived in Los Angeles around that time, and got a cable saying that the hotel had survived the earthquake at the time. It was torn down in 1968 to make room for a taller building. So that part was moved to Meiji-mura. Wright was also a dealer in Japanese art. He was a dealer in Japanese prints, and he did this to make money because Wright, being a fastidious architect, didn't make a lot of money. He didn't always have commissions. He liked to spend money. So even if he got a commission, a commission that paid him, he often spent the money. So he was a dealer in Japanese prints on the side, in order to have a more consistent, more constant income. And this is important. It's important later, so I'll mention why it's important. But his interest in Japan extended beyond architecture, but also to Japanese prints. And this is a very interesting description, Wright's description of his first encounter with Ondol. And I'll just read it here because it's so interesting. The Wright was so surprised at this, and you can imagine how he felt. This was apparently, again, we don't know about the date exactly. Wright said it was 1914. Other scholars say that it was probably early 1917 that he would have first encountered Ondol. So as expected, the dining room was so cold that I couldn't eat, pretending to eat only and for some 19 courses. After dinner, the Baron led the way below to the Korean room, as it was called. This room was about 11 by 15, ceiling 7 feet, I would say. A red felt drugget covered the floor mats. The walls were severely plain, a soft pale yellow in color. We knelt there for conversation and Turkish coffee. The climate seemed to have changed. No, it wasn't the coffee, it was spring. We were soon warm and happy again, kneeling there on the floor, an indescribable warmth. No heating was visible, nor was it felt directly as such. It was really a matter not of heating at all, but an affair of climate. So you can see Wright's impressed by this. And again, his ego, often Wright didn't comment or preferred not to comment about his influences because he was the great creator. In this case, in his autobiography in 1943, he wrote extensively about discovering Ondol and was smitten by it. And then he continues, the Harvard graduate who interpreted for the Baron explained the Korean room meant a room heated under the floor. The heat of a fire outside at one corner of the floor, drawn back and forth underneath the floor in and between tile ducts. the floor forming the top of the flues made by, made by the partitions, the smoke and the heat going up and out of a tall, excuse me, that's a mistake, tall chimney at the corner opposite where the fire was burning. So he got the system pretty well, a little bit wordy, but he was able to get through the interpreter a description of how the Ondol system worked. And of course, the interpreter knew that, and the Baron knew it, or they both knew it. So there was some knowledge here about how things were working. The indescribable comfort of being warmed from below was a discovery. So Wright was really smitten by this. And remember, he was in Japan at the time. And though I love Kyoto and I go to Kyoto every time I go to Korea, the winters in Kyoto were not my favorite part of the year because you have cold feet basically for 3 or 4 months, and how many wool socks I went through, I don't know. So remember, in the context of not Japanese houses being rather drafty and cold, which of course in the summer is fine because you want the humidity to escape, but it's just in the summer. So Wright was really the contrast between the cold Japanese rooms and the warmth of the Ondol really made an impression on Wright. Now, what is the Korean room? Some people say, some people say that it was the Jaseondang, which had been moved from Gyeongbokgung Palace in 1915 to the Okura Kihachiro estate, where Wright had the dinner that he described, that was just described. So it could have been that this building was where Wright had the dinner and then later discovered Ondol. It could have been that. The problem is that Wright said he found the Korean room in 1914. This building was in Korea in 1914. It was disassembled and taken to Japan in 1915. So we're not really sure of the dating of, or which actually, what room, what did he actually see? And a professor, Kim Hyun-sup at Korea University, has done a lot of research on this. He's very interesting. He's done a lot of very interesting research. And he noted that he asked this question: what Korean room did Wright actually see? And what kind of Korean room did Wright experience in person? It could just have been an Ondol room made in Okura's Japanese house. Okura might have constructed a rather complex installation of the fireplace flue chimney with a raised floor. So it could have been this, right? And however, there is also the possibility that it was a separate Korean building. We know that in September 1916, Okura built a Korean building in his residence named Chosenkan, or Korean house. It involved the removal of the existing building named Jaseondang from the Gyeongbokgung Palace, a process carried out under the Japanese colonial dispolitation policy in colonized Korea. Despite the discrepancy of timing between the winter of 1914 in his own description and the reconstruction of Jaseondang in 1916, it was plausibly the Jaseondang that Wright had come across because the architect sometimes mixed up the years of his visits to Japan. So this is a problem, actually, finding out what he saw. Studies clearly, some studies clarify that he was in Japan in 1913 and in 1917, but not in 1914. If this was true, his experience of Korean architecture was more integral because he observed a whole Korean building. In any case, it is certain that Wright's contact with Korean architecture inspired his later designs. So whether it's another building or the Jaseondang, it would be nice to find out, and hopefully that will come out later as researchers do more digging. But the key point is that Wright found Ondol in Japan at this time and incorporated it into his later designs. And the first thing he tried to do was this, he first tried to incorporate it into the Johnson Wax Administration Building, which is in Wisconsin. And in the middle of that, he got a contract to build the first Usonian house, the Jacobs first house, and he was able to implement the system in this house while working on the Johnson Wax Administration Building. And then later in his various Usonian houses up until the mid 1950s, late 1950s, Wright built houses with underfloor radiant heating. And regarding in the same autobiography that where he just described the Korean room, right, the next paragraph, he first tried to implement it in this Nakoma Country Club. That didn't come to fruition. So then came, so that he's talking about the Johnson Administration Building. Then came the Johnson Administration Building, just the thing for that, and we proceeded with the installation, but the professional heating contractors, except one, scoffed, refusing to have anything to do with the idea. But as chance had it, the Little Jacobs house turned up in meantime and was completed before the greater venture got into operation. So he was working with the two at the same time. For the Johnson Wax Building, however, Wright didn't use heated pipes of water. He used wrought iron pipes that were to carry steam. So Wright thought that steam going through the pipes would then heat the floor. So this was his first design of a major large-scale underfloor heating system. The problem, of course, with steam is that once you heat steam, it really wants to escape, and it's very problematic how the steam is going to run through these pipes too fast to allow it to heat. And so there were lots of problems with implementing this system. Eventually, Wright did it, and the system was implemented. However, people found it hard to deal with because the floor would be sort of tepid, and then the rest of the room would be cold, the rest of the space would be cold. So they ended up building another heating system, and now these pipes have been used for electric wires. So they aren't totally lost, but it really wasn't used very much as a heating system. For the Jacobs house, however, he was able to get it going, the idea of pipes under the floor carrying hot water, and that would radiate up. And this is an interior picture. I've not seen this house. This is an interior picture. And of course, the other thing that Wright was interested in was he wanted to get rid of radiators. He didn't like radiators. I live in a house with radiators, so maybe toward the end of this lecture, the radiators will come on and you'll hear the noise. Wright thought that radiators were primitive and had to be, so he wanted something that was quiet and silent, and that he could, that was, as well as being warm and healthful and natural, with heat radiating up because heat rises. So there were lots of philosophical, aesthetic reasons wound up together why Wright was interested in experiencing this. He liked that clean line of the floor. And this is from another house. This is in Missouri. So this is a different house, but it's a Usonian house. And you can see the heating system that Wright prefabricated wrought iron coils, put down, and that would have been the basis for the heating system that Wright developed. This was used in many of the Usonian houses. And fortunately, before my last visit to Korea before the pandemic, I had one day, and I was able to, near the Detroit airport before getting the Delta flight to Seoul. And I was fortunate enough to be able to visit a Wright Usonian house in the suburbs of Detroit. They didn't let you take pictures unless you paid $50 more. So I'm stingy, so I only was able to take exterior pictures. But I was able to see the house, and it was my first experience inside a Wright Usonian house. This is not my picture. This is from their website. And as I sat here and looked out and enjoyed the house, but as I walked around, there are no heat ducts. There are no heat ducts. This is all underfloor heating. Of course, this is August, so I wasn't able to experience that, but I did ask the docent, do you use the underfloor heating? And he said yes, and that the tours end in November, but the ones in October and November, you would be able to experience the underfloor heating. But again, Wright was interested in this clean line and getting rid of radiators and other mechanical things that would have broken up this view that he was interested in. Finally, because again, not finally, but because of Wright's experiment status, we have these other people that I've mentioned, and so we'll go right into it. Mies van der Rohe, the Farnsworth house, took a long time to build. It's not the biggest house, it's only 800 square feet. And the reason it took so long to build was because of Mies van der Rohe's conflict with the Mrs. Farnsworth, who he had trouble with. He had an affair with her, they broke up, they had conflicts, she didn't like the house, and there were legal issues, and it was a real big affair. But this house used underfloor heating. So Mies van der Rohe probably, but no documentation, probably picked up the idea from Wright. It was in the air at the time, or he might have been able to pick it up from Europe, because Mies van der Rohe, as you know, was the director of the Bauhaus School, and he immigrated to the United States to avoid the Nazis in 1938. Wright helped him at the time to get established in the United States. Wright and Mies van der Rohe were friends at the time. After Wright saw this house, Wright panned it and said it was a horrible monstrosity and everything, and really criticized the house. Whether he criticized the house because he didn't like it, or because he didn't like the idea of some other famous architect picking up underground heat, that would require documentation to assert. But it's interesting that this high-profile modernist house used underfloor heating, and this is Mies van der Rohe's underfloor heating. You can see again a dense network of pipes flowing under the house. At the same time, and this house was built much faster, you can see it only took a year to build. Again, a very small house. This is another very famous house in modernist architecture, the international style. And of course, by this time, things had expanded beyond where Wright was, because the idea was to use all man-made materials and glass and steel and wood, and the bricks had sort of faded out by this time. Phillip Johnson's glass house in Connecticut also used underfloor heating. And where he got the idea is not documented, but it would be good to dig into that. He knew Mies van der Rohe, but of course, if you look at the dates, you can see that this is immediate post-war period, and that's when the industry, the home building industry, was talking about Wright's underfloor radiant heating systems. Another experiment was Phillip Hallick, and this was, Phillip Hallick had studied Wright's system, he knew about Wright, and he implemented, again, the same idea of pipes underwater in a gravel bed to make a house in Pennsylvania. He only made one house with this, and he was not a large scale builder. He was more of an upscale builder for architect and builder, building houses for wealthy clients. But he directly mentioned that he took the idea from Wright's Usonian houses. And there were other experiments, some that departed from Wright. And so they might have taken the idea of underfloor radiant heating, the idea that heat rises and it's better to have warmer feet than cold feet, or better to have your feet, your lower part of the body warm, and the upper part of your body will feel warm even though the air is cooler. So this is a system that harks back to the original sort of Korean Ondol with warm air flowing under the floor. This uses heat ducts, the kind of heat ducts that, say, you would have in a typical American house that have developed over the time. This was running warm air under heat ducts under the floor. And of course, combining this heating system with solar heat, meaning at the time, not solar panels, but windows, and organizing the windows so that the windows would be able to capture the peak of the sun. So this solar homes company developed this system. They tried to market it. It didn't work. And they soon went bankrupt. So there were only a very few houses built with the system. But what was interesting is not their success or failure. What is interesting is that they were taking this idea that was in the air in the 1940s and trying to expand upon it, trying to market it and implement it in another way. And this suggests the power of Wright's influence in this field. The biggest implementation, however, of Wright's underfloor heating was, or underfloor radiant heating in the United States, is the two Levittowns, one in New York City that was built from 1947 to 1951, and the other near Philadelphia that was built from 1952 to 1958. And Levitt and Sons was founded, this is a home builder company, and it was developed by Abraham Levitt in 1929, terrible year to start building houses. That's when the Depression hit. After the war, his two sons, William and Alfred Levitt, took up the family business, and they led the post-war developments of the two Levittowns. And Alfred Levitt followed the construction of the Ben Redcoon House in Great Neck Estates, New York. This was a Usonian house, which meant that it would have had the underfloor radiant heating system that Wright developed. And this was very close to the time of the Jacobs house, so they were being done simultaneously. So Alfred Levitt took 10 months off the family business to visit the site every day, to talk with the builders, maybe talk with Wright, no record of that. But he followed the development of this house very closely. His father, in 1939, wrote a letter to the Taliesin Foundation inquiring about Wright's radiant heat system, Taliesin Foundation, inquiring about Wright's radiant heating system. And so his father, probably the boys were too young, and the father was the owner of the business, so they had Dad write and ask for information about Wright's underfloor heating system. Will you please send me a rough sketch and an explanation in general of the heating system utilizing the brick floor as a dispenser of heat, which Mr. Wright uses in his later dwellings. And so he wanted information about this. So this is a connection then between the Levitts and Wright. And Wright did not respond. It's not clear, there's no record of Wright having responded, but clearly the Levitts, particularly Alfred Levitt, knew Wright's work, and they were interested in what was going on. And of course, this is a picture of Levittown, New York. These are all Cape Cod style houses. And this is a picture of the construction of the underfloor heating system that in the Levittown houses. And of course, the important thing about Levittown was it was the application of Fordism, i.e. sort of assembly line production, to the building of houses. So what they did is they were building a house completing a house every 1 or 2 days. So they were building a massive amount of housing in a very short time. And you can see that they used this wood base, and they filled it in, and then they put down the coils. And I'll talk about problems related to that later, but you can see that this was a very large scale application of radiant heat, underfloor radiant heat in the United States. And why didn't they build basements? Well, basements were more expensive. Basements took more time. So the idea from the Levitt perspective wasn't the philosophical or aesthetic things that Wright was interested in. It was the idea, well, if you don't have to have a basement, then you can speed up the process of building. So get rid of the basement, cut costs, and speed up the building process. It was a great idea. We'll see what happened to it. And they developed a boiler system, and this, so there were lots of parts, moving parts, but this company, the Bell and Gasset company, developed a boiler system to move the water under the floors. And the second Levittown, this is these are advertisements, promotional pictures from promotional literature for the second Levittown, and this is the Levittowner model. And you can see kind of some more Wrightish influences, a carport, a little bit more open space, not the Cape Cod style house of the first Levittown in New York. So again, you can see that the Levitts would have been influenced by Wright, and Wright, of course, had emerged by the time 1950s. Wright was even more influential in the American architectural scene, even though he was older at that time. And this idea of this floor going out to a window that goes from floor to ceiling, you can see that might have been taken from Wright. And so the influence of Wright was all over this Levittowner model, and it included radiant heating under the floor. And of course, there's a fireplace as well. So kind of interesting, you would have two heating systems. This is from Dan Holohan, who wrote an article about about the heating systems, and quite a bit of this article focuses on Levittown. And he says, I grew up in Hicksville next to Levittown. We played on warm floors as children and believed that anything was possible. Some of us became famous rock stars, and some of us wound up writing stories about radiant heat. All of us remember its comfort. So the famous rock star in this quote is Billy Joel. Billy Joel grew up in Levittown, and he experienced, living in a house with radiant heat. And of course, this their fond memories again of this system. And of course, once Levittown started, Levittown was a very high-profile project, just the scale and the speed of which the houses were built. So it received a lot of attention. And that meant that you were starting to see the promotion of underfloor heating in the trade literature or home building world. You have brass and copper in your home, radiant heating, the warm, nice floors. And then you have this again, hydroflow radiant heating, another system. So these companies were developing, trying to promote radiant heating at the same time that it had been implemented in the Levittown developments. And of course, the Levittown, the corollary to Levittown is later, Levitt fell out of favor because the Levittowns had covenants that prevented African Americans and Jewish people from buying homes in those areas. So later, Levitt was subject to civil rights investigations in the later in the 1960s, and he was much criticized for the racist nature of the developments that he promoted, but the racial exclusion in the developments. So that legacy now of racism in the developments is something that people are also talking about in terms of the overall legacy of the Levittown developments. And 1945 was a big year. Of course, the war ended, and two books came out. One book and an exhibition, but the exhibition had a catalog with it. But this book was really an influential book, because if you think of World War II ending, and it was sort of like the end of the coronavirus. Everything changed quickly once the war ended, and the federal government, the US federal government, began to switch gears from the war effort to promoting suburban development. And that was the need. There was a acute housing shortage in the United States at the time. Remember, at the peak of the war, 22% of all men, American men, were overseas in the war. 22%. That's a huge number of people. So after the war, they all came back. They all needed a place to live. They got married. They started families. There was this huge, this massive shortage of housing. So the federal government began to switch to promote the development of new housing. And at the other end, wealthy clients, wealthy people who couldn't build houses during the Depression, or particularly during the war, they took an interest. So there was this boom in interest in housing. And this book was a very early influential book. And in the book, the authors ask this question: is radiant heating then the complete answer to all our problems? It could be, in the opinion of many authorities, if factors were present. One of the factors is house design. This kind of heating works at its best in a one-story house, although it has been successfully applied to those with 2 floors. So you can see that these authors, and of course, George Nelson is a very important post-war designer of furniture and very important post-war designer. You can see that they are again extolling the virtues of radiant heat. There was a show in 1945 at MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, Small House, tomorrow's Small House. And in the gallery catalog, the curator, Elizabeth Mock, writes, the architects have all voluntarily rejected cellars and attics. Each house is designed for erection on a complete floor slab with provision for radiant heating incorporated in floor, walls, or ceiling, and the compact, fully automatic heating plants are logically placed on the ground floor. So this is the idea that, well, get rid of the basement, and it's a much faster, easier process of construction. And this is the image that was used in the promotion of this talk. Kind of a very interesting image. I was shocked to find it when I first did research on this. It's in the Popular Mechanics magazine, which still exists, kind of a nerdy, interesting magazine that I sometimes look at. And L.G. Nonini, an American mining engineer, this is where the magazine got the information from Mr. Nonini. And he was working in Korea in the late 1950s for the United Nations Korea Reconstruction Agency, and advised the Siheung graphite mill. Later in the 1960s, he was an engineer for the Koryo mine operated by the Korean Consolidated Mining Company. And there was a recent article in the Korea Times by Robert Neff about this. So you can follow up on that. But this Mr. Lou Nonini, who did this, who was the source of the information for this infographic, he knew Korea well. And it's interesting that they were presenting this, the question, is radiant heating modern? So they were trying to give, the magazine was trying to give some historical legitimacy to, to the idea of radiant heating, and very interesting infographic. And of course, this was part of this infographic coming out in 1949 was again part of this period of promoting radiant heating in the United States. But Wright wasn't necessarily pleased by all this, because remember, as I said, Wright had this big ego and he wanted to defend his territory, obviously. So he wrote in the same autobiography that I've quoted earlier, articles on radiant heat began to appear in testimonial journals. So this is perhaps even things like Popular Mechanics and other professional journals, but it was in no sense radiant heat or panel heating or any of the things they called it that I was interested in. It was simply gravity heat, heat coming from beneath as naturally as heat rises. So Wright wanted to control the terminology of, he didn't want, he wanted to control what it was called. So he called it gravity heat, not radiant heat. Some 30 or more Usonian buildings now have floor heating. We have had to learn to proportion the heat correctly for varying climates and conditions. We have accumulated some data that is useful. There is no other ideal heat, not even the heat of the sun. So again, Wright is simply smitten by this, the idea of warm floors. No other ideal heat, not even the sun. So the sun is coming out finally in my over in Rhode Island now. But this just underscores how smitten, how taken by the idea of warm floors that Wright was. And finally, I'll conclude, I hope I'm not going over time too much, the decline of this sort of experimental boom in underfloor radiant heating, Wright's legacy, and a short comment on revival in recent years. The first problem was technical difficulties. The other is this cultural attachment to a basement. I hate to use the word cultural attachment, but the American, in northern climates, the desire for a basement. And finally, forced air systems were cheaper and easier to install. And so the first thing is technological difficulties. At the first Jacob, this is William Cronin in another gallery catalog about a Wright exhibition. He wrote that at the first Jacob's house, the radiant heating beneath the floor had never been wholly successful. But when its cast iron pipes finally began to leak, there was no way to gain access to them. The only solution was to remove the entire floor and start over. So this is a comment about the problem, which was essentially in some of the Levittown houses, there were poor construction. Remember, they were building these houses quickly. The pipes had to be laid down carefully, soldered together if there was a hole. There were all kinds of variables. And, you know, there are problems with construction. Then even if you get it right, the problem is that over time, pipes corrode. Copper and wrought iron corrode with being buried under concrete and with water. The weak foundation, of course, this was the Levittown house. You can see the wood foundation here holding the gravel, which made the bed for the pipes. That, of course, rotted because wood rots when it touches the ground and is buried in cement. So there were all these technical issues that caused trouble. And it meant that they were difficult to maintain, that, you know, if you got it right and the house would last a certain number of years, and then you would have to tear up the entire floor. So this was the real problem, is there was no way to repair or fix the pipes. The other issue, of course, is the influence of basements. And I'm from Michigan. I now live in Rhode Island. And of course, this is 2013, but basically, if you look at the map, you can see that in the Midwest and going all the way to the Northeast, basements are very dominant. 87% of new houses, 87% of the houses built in New England, it's really, and then you go to the South and the West and it drops. And some states have requirements for basements. Other states have partial basement requirements. It just depends on the age of the house and the state. And but clearly in this area, if you were to say in Michigan, where I grew up, if you were to own a house on a slab, the value of your house would be less because people don't want to live on a cold slab. And this problem of the houses on a slab being perceived as less desirable, less comfortable, less valuable means that most houses are built with a basement or at least a partial basement. Partial basement would also give you access to pipes under. So the attachment to the basement is a real thing. And then the other thing is the type of heating. So central warm air furnace, all US homes, about 60%, a little more than 60%. And of course, single detached houses, it goes up to about 65, 70%, have a furnace in the basement or a furnace somewhere, pumping warm air in a duct that comes out with at a vent. So this system is something that is sort of the norm. And I remember when I lived in Ann Arbor, and at the beginning of the talk, I mentioned I had cold feet. For fun, I inquired about putting in a underfloor heating system, and it's much, much more expensive. It's much more complicated to put in that kind of warm water, hot water underfloor heating system in an existing house. So builders want to go with something that is easy to build, that is readily available and easy to repair. And in the United States, that is the forced air system. That's sort of the norm. And so Wright's legacy, and of course, this is an interesting comment, perhaps as a way, again, by William Cronin in his gallery catalog essay, perhaps as a way of acknowledging his debt without admitting its direct architectural significance, Wright repeatedly asserted that it was Japanese prints, not buildings, that had affected his mature style. So Wright didn't want to really admit being influenced by something, which is interesting. So that leads us to this, that Wright's open admission of influence from the Korean room, that his open admission that this Korean system influenced him was rather rare. It's a rare example of where, he admitted the influence from somewhere else. And of course, Wright, again, but having admitted that, his approach was to interpret it in his own way. And that wasn't from a practical point of view, it was from an aesthetic and philosophical stance. So he was interested in the naturalness of heat rising. The body, if it's warmer if your feet are warm, then the air above can be cooler and you still don't feel cold. The aesthetic of no vents and no radiators and an open space that can kind of go right to the edge of the windows. And so he was really interested in this from an aesthetic and philosophical stance, not a practical stance. He didn't want to market it to millions of people. He wasn't concerned about making money off of it. It was a completely aesthetic and philosophical approach. But his prestige as the leading architect, this created this short-lived boom in underfloor radiant heating systems that was part of a broader or bigger period of experimentation in housing. Then after the war, you had this large market for housing, and you were able to, so this was a period of lots of different experimentation. Experiments were going on. Underfloor radiant heating was one of them, but it died because it wasn't practical. It wasn't able to compete with other systems that were cheaper, easier to implement, and fit the needs of the people who were buying houses at the time. Recently, however, into the 2000s, if you click on a Home Depot, you can underfloor heating, and you get all kinds of hits. And recently, what has happened is there's been a revival of interest in this. And the revival of interest, of course, comes from, what it comes from is an interesting question. Perhaps it comes from the idea that people really do like the underfloor heating is really something good that people want to implement in their houses. But there are two systems that are becoming popular in the United States. One is electric systems, and the other, of course, is hot water pipe systems of the type that Frank Lloyd Wright, but obviously more advanced. The electric systems tend to be electric mats that you would put under tile or under wood, and these are generally used for smaller spaces, say a bathroom or a kitchen, part of a room, and these are easy to implement. They don't have water, there are no pumps. It's just connecting it to an electric source. The others are hot water radiant heat systems, but instead of using copper or pipes that corrode, they use PCV. And this is, of course, if you go to see the construction of a Korean house or Korean building, you will see similar, not exactly the same, but similar kind of PCV pipes that are used to create the heating system. So the problem, of course, with the hot water systems is they're much larger, they require a boiler, again, more expensive. So really these small scale heating systems are the ones that are becoming more popular in the United States today, which leads to the conclusion, so are we going, sort of back to the Imperial Hotel? And this is from Wright's autobiography, where he discusses, after discovering the Korean room, he then says, I immediately arranged for electric heating elements beneath the bathrooms in the Imperial Hotel, dropping the ceiling of the bathrooms to create a space beneath each in which to generate heat. The tile floor and the built-in tile baths were thus always warm. It was pleasant to go in one's bare feet to the bath. And that is probably why these small scale electric heating systems are becoming popular in American bathrooms, because it's nice. And of course, those systems allow it to be implemented easily and without a lot of problems. The experiment was a success. All ugly electric fixtures, dangerous too in a bathroom, were eliminated. I've always hated fixtures, radiators especially. Here was the complete opportunity to digest all the paraphernalia in the building, creating not a heated interior, but creating climate, healthful, dustless, and serene. So this really, the idea of healthful, dustless, serene, without radiators and ugly stuff, this is really what Wright was, why Wright was so attracted and so taken by underfloor radiant heating. So references here, and on that note, I will open it up for questions.
Hey, Robert, thank you very much. That's very interesting. In my 40-some years of experience in Korea, I've been in more than one house where the floor had to be jackhammered out to replace the corroded pipes. And now they're using this, it's not PVC, it's more of a pliable plastic sort of a product that maybe it'll have longer life, but we don't know yet. It hasn't been long enough.
We don't know. Yeah.
Folks, we want to open this discussion up for your questions. There's two ways you can do that. You can either type a question in the chat box and I'll try to monitor those to keep the discussion going, or at the bottom of the Zoom window, there's a participants icon. And if you'll pop up that list of participants, there's a raise your hand function at the bottom of the list of participants. And so we'll take any questions that you have. Please jump in. Okay, let me go to Tessa Franklin. Tessa, go ahead.
All right, sorry, I'm on mobile, so I'm figuring out where all the buttons are.
Yeah, it's a little different. Go ahead.
So I had a question about there was a wave of houses that were made in I think the 50s, you said, right?
Right.
So do we know what's happened to those systems? Like, the houses have probably changed hands. Like, are they just people just not using it? Or like, do you know, is there anybody still trying it out?
Great question. And I probably should have mentioned that. Almost all of the systems have been taken out. And that actually happened not too long after they were built. So that would have happened, say, even starting in the late 50s, 60s. Levittown, New York, that happened first, of course, because it was built first. So yeah, most of the houses have, all of those heating systems have been taken out. A few would have it. people who've wanted to restore it or who've, got lucky where the system lasted, but almost all of them have been replaced with the typical under forced air heating system. And a lot of the houses themselves have been modified. So actually, when I was preparing this talk before the, for doing this research before the pandemic, I thought of going to Levittown, near New York. Rhode Island's not that far from New York, and trying to see all the Levittown houses, but quickly found out that the houses themselves have been remodeled. And of course, the other thing is these houses weren't very big, so a lot of the houses have been torn down and rebuilt with much bigger houses.
Thank you.
Just to add one other thing to your question, the Usonian houses built by Frank Lloyd Wright, many of them have owners who care for the houses, and those underfloor heating systems have been preserved.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thanks for your question.
Mr. Bashir, go ahead and ask your question. I just accidentally clicked the mute on you.
Hello, everyone from Chicago. It's really early in the morning here. Thank you so much, Professor Fouser, for this wonderful and informative presentation, as expected from RAS events. I taught English in South Korea for a couple of years, and that's how I became affiliated with the RAS lectures.
Great.
So I guess my question, I was driving through Ohio, and I noticed that in a large sort of neighborhood, there were many ponds right outside of small houses. And so I was wondering if there were any systems that were built or designed that you know of that combined maybe geothermal energy or swimming pools along, because water is, water is continuing to be used and looked at as a source of, as basically a fundamental storage for energy. So as the world is looking for storage solutions to our fluctuating and renewable energy, cycles and grid, working towards the smart grid, water storage is becoming, a huge factor. So I was wondering, my first question, I guess, is, are you aware of any projects or large, small civil engineering type that use maybe geothermal energy or swimming pools as a storage of latent heat, or to pump, pipe, etc., that latent heat?
Great question. I can't answer it with any authority, because I was when I looked at all these 1940s, 1950s building magazines or journals or promotional material, I was focusing on radiant heat. But I did find some systems where they were using, say, I did see a reference for systems that used glass pipes with water running through them to catch, where the sun would heat the water in the glass pipes. That wasn't a Wright system, but it was something else that I saw in passing in doing my research. So there was that. And then there was also an interest in cooling with water. So I did see something that showed the idea of radiant air conditioning, or not radiant, where you have colder water flowing above in a ceiling, and then that would cause the cool air to settle. So I did see things like that, but I can't answer it more than that. It's a great topic. So it might be something to research, like, something to follow up on mid 20th century approaches to eco-friendly heating and cooling systems.
Where,
and
again, I'm sorry, where were these glass pipes?
That was in a journal. There in a journal that contained a reference to one of the underwater heating systems that I saw. So I only read that part of the journal, but in scrolling through it, I saw something about the glass pipes. And the other thing, just to maybe add to your question, is The solar energy that was mentioned in the talk, the solar homes, that was kind of a big thing, and because partly for ecological, environmental reasons, but also cost. The idea was to reduce the cost of carrying a house or maintaining a house. So there was some also solar, but as far as water, I did see those few references. So you might want to dig into some of the mid 20th century, say, architecture forum, or all these old, sources of promotional and trade information are available online.
Thank you again. Will your
Doesn't answer
slide
your question, but it's a very interesting topic.
Thank you. Will your slides be available can we email you for the slides for your presentation or? Yes.
And if I find anything, I'll that relates to your question, I'll shoot it over to you.
Final comment. There's a joint venture between it's called Glass Point out of California and Oman, and they basically created a greenhouse structure using parabolic. They created a greenhouse structure over parabolic solar troughs, and I'm not sure if the pipe that they used was glass for collecting that solar energy, but it from a pilot project, it became a huge civil engineering operation. I think it's one of the largest in just a matter of the last few years.
Right.
But this is in a completely different field in oil extraction and stuff, but similar, a solar concept. Thank you again for the insightful presentation on his personality, and how he influenced the whole Ondol.
Thank you for attending. You're 1 hour earlier in Chicago, so.
Yeah. Great, thanks for your question. Robert, there's a question in the chat box about the traditional Ondol system. If the chimney that goes under the floor gets full, how can it be cleaned out?
I don't know.
Those channels that go under the floor.
I think probably the space, however, is wide enough that you would be able to clean it out, because if you look on my slides, the beginning, you can see that. Let me share the screen. You can see here that this is wide enough that you would be able to probably clean through here, going through this way. So I think it's probably cleanable. I've never heard of it being clogged, but again, I don't know. It's an interesting question.
Well, I think, in a Western style chimney where the fire is directly underneath the flue, those have to be cleaned out of soot occasionally so that they don't catch fire. I'm not sure we'd have the same kind of a problem in a Korean Ondol system, but
right, this opening, in theory, you might be able to take these bricks out, or can everybody see this? This would probably be cleanable. That would be my guess.
Yeah. I lived in a house that used we were using Yuntan coal. We'd moved from the wood because they had to change the systems because of lack of wood. We have one of our RAS members who lives in an old style Hanok house, which still uses the wood agungi, or the fireplace. It says agungi on your chart. Okay, good.
Right.
He also has a hot water system in the floors too, but every now and again he runs the wood fires to keep the floor construction in good shape, he says.
Right.
Neighbors don't appreciate all the smoke.
Probably not, yeah. And they're not used to fireplaces like, in New England, a lot of people have fireplaces.
Yeah. A comment in the chat box about the word crap.
Yes.
It's a Middle English word not related to Thomas Crapper.
Oh, okay.
Its use in connection with privies predates him.
Oh,
Oh,
okay. Well,
okay.
thank you for correcting me. I read that it had come from him, but that
I
it's
had
not.
read that too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for your comment, Algie. Anybody else? We've got time for maybe one more question. I don't see anybody struggling to get the floor. Oh, wait, I've got one. Okay. Please ask your question.
Yes, hello. First of all, can you hear me okay?
Yes,
Yes,
you're
yes.
fine.
Thank you very much for the talk. Very, very insightful. Yeah, simple question. I found the part about Frank Lloyd Wright discovering that in the Korean room in Japan quite fascinating. Do you know if there was an influence of Ondol in Japan around that time into more mainstream Japanese society or certain kinds of architecture or not?
That's a great question. And it's what I want to research next. So I only sort of put my feet into it a little bit. But there was also a fear of Ondol, because at the time, the Ondol they were thinking about was the kind that had the fire under the floor. And Japan traditionally, because of earthquakes and the density of population in places like Kyoto, Osaka, Edo, was fearful of fire. So the fear of fire really kept any experiments in Ondol to high-end houses, and it never reached a kind of mass, it never really broke through. The other thing about Ondol in Japan, of course, at this time, there were the Japanese who might have been interested in it. But after the war, the Koreans who lived in Japan, or during, the immigration of Koreans during the colonial period, and then after the war, Koreans in Japan also tried to experiment with Ondol. And that that became more common after the development of hot water flowing systems. And then later, of course, as Japan developed and became a wealthier country, the underfloor hot water systems became popular in Hokkaido, the northern part of Japan. And recently, electric systems have become popular, but that's all later 20th century. So at this time, when Wright was doing the work in Japan, there would have been very few, and there was a fear of fire that would have kept that at bay. But of course, later in the 20th century and 21st century, a lot of Japanese houses now do have electric, particularly electric Ondol systems, or radiant heat systems.
I see, super. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. Well, Robert, thanks again for getting up early and sharing with us. Fascinating story about Frank Lloyd Wright. We really appreciate your efforts. Folks.
Thank you for having me.
You bet. Yep. The next online meeting of the Literature Club will be Thursday, April 22nd at 7:30 p.m. Those in attendance will be expected to have read the book Loving by Jung Ho Sung, translated by Brother Anthony. If you are in Korea, you can get that at the RAS office. Give Joanne a call. The colloquium that we do in conjunction with the, I'm not even going to try and say it in French, the French Overseas School, is also on Thursday, April 22nd, but at 6 p.m. The topic is Korean artists in France. The Business and Culture Club had a great walk this morning, or at noontime, through Ukura Palace. The weather was spectacular for a lunchtime break. The next lunchtime walk will be on May 18th at noon. Meet at the entrance to Ukura Palace again, opposite Seoul City Hall. And this time we'll walk around outside the perimeter of the palace wall. Today we walked inside the perimeter. It was very interesting. Pardon me. Please check our website and our YouTube channel where you can find recordings of past lectures and other useful content. Our next lecture will be on April 27th, 2 weeks from tonight, by David Mason. David's a longtime RAS Korea member and lecturer. He'll be talking about the 4 golden ages as a framework of studying and understanding Korean history. He argues that the Korean nation has enjoyed 4 distinct golden ages of strength, prosperity, and creation of great cultural treasures. The 4th golden age began in 1988, so in his opinion, we are still in that 4th golden age. The previous ages were each about 200 years. In between them were dark ages, so to speak, where there was a lot of suffering or stagnation. So we're looking forward to listening to David in 2 weeks. We look forward to seeing all of you then. Thank you very much and have a good evening. And good morning to you, Robert.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks
Good night,
everybody
all.
for coming. It was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.